they left her to die. That pink giant of a pig stood alone in the last pen at the county auction, steam rising off her back in the cold and her eyes following every motion. Whispers traveled through the clutter of men in boots. Too big to feed. Useless. Dangerous if it breaks a fence. Most shook their heads and walked on. The veteran leaned against the wooden rail, shoulders stiff and eyes dark from too many sleepless nights. He had come with no clear plan, only a restless urge to move, to feel something beyond the weight of his own memories. His house was empty, his tools rusting in the shed, his body bearing scars others couldn't see. The auctioneer's gavel cracked again and again for farm dogs, bales of hay, goats with bright eyes. But when that massive pig's turn came, silence pressed down. No hands lifted, no bids called. She was too much animal for anyone sensible. He should have looked away. Instead, he watched her watching him. Not a blink, not a step back. Just two tired creatures marking each other through the dust and noise. The pen smelled of straw and old fear. Yet in her gaze there was something unspoken, like a question only he could answer. And before he could explain, even to himself, the thought lodged hard in his chest. Why does this unwanted giant matter to me? This wasn't about feed or profit. It was about recognition. The county fairgrounds had turned rough with noon heat. Dust blew up in sheets across the wooden pens where animals bawled and shuffled. Farmers leaned on rails with coffee in hand, calling jokes at each other, letting their numbers fly at the auctioneer's fast chant. It was a marketplace, yes, but it was also theater. Bragging rights, pride, and neighbors weighing one another's fortunes under a tin roof rattling in the wind. The veteran knew this scene well enough. He had drifted by auctions in past years, never staying long. Crowds put his chest on edge. The sharp clatter of the auctioneer's tongue came too close to the crack of weapons. Even now he tried to keep to the edges where shadows gathered, breathing slow, grounding himself in the grit under his boots. At one pen, boys laughed out loud at the pig's swollen size. Her hide was pale rose, blotched with darker stains. She filled nearly the whole pen, so that her movement pushed straw in waves. One man spat and said she wouldn't make it through another winter unless someone poured half a barn's grain into her. Another cracked that her only worth would be on a plate. None of them raised a single number card when her lot came. The veteran stayed still, watching the way her ears twitched with every jeer. She didn't lunge or panic. She only stood with her head angled low, her wet eyes lifting briefly like a soldier posting silent guard. It caught him harder than expected, that calm in the middle of mockery. He told himself it wasn't his matter. He had no savings beyond a tight roll in his jacket, barely enough to patch his own roof. Big animals meant constant feed, strong fences, none of which he had. He could rent his days out for wages, but most of those earned dollars already leaked into fuel and bills. And yet, he remembered standing in another kind of holding yard, lined with sandbags instead of rails. There, too, men were counted and judged. Who was fit to carry weight? Who might fail under fire? Some had been written off before the trial began. He had hated that feeling, being numbers shuffled for usefulness. Looking at the pig now, he saw the same discard. She was marked useless before given a chance. The auctioneer gave half a try to spur bidding. His chant slowed, then stopped. The words came flat. Passed over, folks. Let's move on. He swung toward the next pen, hammer ready. The veteran's voice rose before he had planned it. Just 2 words, I'll take her. The crush of talk around him paused. A few heads tilted his way, some smirking. One asked if he'd lost his mind. Another said the man must be drunk. But the veteran held his ground, though his stomach turned to stone. He pressed forward and set the few dollars he could manage. It wasn't a profit choice. It was a claim. The gavel dropped. Just like that, the biggest pig under that roof was his. Hauling her home proved harder than he thought. The trailer he borrowed creaked under her weight, tires bowing on the gravel lane. She snorted deep, shaking the floorboards each time she shifted. More than once he wondered if she would burst free and vanish into the fields. But she stayed in place, staring through the slats as fences and miles rolled past. At his farm, such as it was, the yard looked lonely. A sagging porch on an old frame house, grass climbing through rusted plow blades at the edge. He cut the rope and coaxed her down the ramp. She stepped slow, deliberate, testing ground as though each inch carried danger. He felt the same whenever he walked into a crowded store, measuring every face, each exit. In that strange mirrored silence, they understood each other. She needed a name. He knew animals fared better when you called them something worth repeating. No word came at first. He paced, scratched at his beard, let her snuff through weeds. Then it struck him. Maybelle. The syllables slid out, calm, almost like a lull to himself. The pig looked up, ears flicking once. Then she went back to rooting. Yet from that moment, she wasn't just the pig. She carried a name, and the name carried weight back to him. Driving the empty trailer into town later, wind cutting his face, he felt the choice growing heavier. Neighbors would scoff. Money would tighten further. Nights might stretch longer with worry. But when he replayed the way her eyes locked on his, he knew no one else could have taken her and still lived honest. She was his charge now, for better or worse. And maybe that was the first step towards something different. Gravel whispered under the trailer wheels as he eased the rig into the yard. The house hunched against a backdrop of trees, clapboards gray from years of neglect, windows dulled with dust. He cut the engine, and silence dropped heavy over them both. Then came a long, resonant grunt from the back, like the clearing of a throat before a speech. The pig shifted, and the trailer rocked as if bearing a slow tide. He pulled the latch and swung the ramp low. The pig leaned her head out first, nostrils flaring, eyes flicking side to side. He stood off to one side, hands tucked in pockets, letting the air and scents of this place reach her before he did. She stepped down like a wrestler entering the ring, slow, deliberate, each hoof making the boards groan. Then she stood on his soil for the first time, filling the yard with her sheer presence. The farm wasn't much to show. A lean-to barn where the roof curled at the corners, fences patched with wire and rope. Tools leaned against siding like soldiers retired from their post. Inside, the house guarded rooms full of silence, shelving that carried dust thicker than books, a table scarred from years of knives and bottles. He had lived there mostly passing time, not living. Now she filled a corner of the yard with her bulk, and suddenly the place seemed occupied again. For the first days, the rhythm between man and pig was awkward. He scattered grain into a trough, and she charged it with head low, water splashing from a barrel nearby. He patched a pen around her with boards and wire, climbing the posts until his palms split open again. She paced the fence line for hours, snorting deep, flanks expanding like slow bellows. At night, the sound carried faint across the fields, steady, unsettling, but also alive in a way the property rarely felt. The veteran's own nights carried harder sounds. He still startled awake from dreams that lifted him back under foreign skies. Sometimes he woke half standing, searching for a rifle that wasn't within reach. When the sweat and pounding heart left him shaking, he would look out the window into moonlight. In the yard, she moved, a pale mass shifting against shadows. That simple presence anchored him, kept him from drifting into the old panic.
He studied her by daylight, finding the scars of older neglect. Sparse hair along her spine, ridges where rope had once cut her hide, patches of hardened skin. She had endured mistreatment and carried it plain. Still, when he muttered to her, not in speeches, just low directions or soft curses, she would pause her pacing. Her ears flicked, her eyes slid toward him, and the air seemed to change. She had heard, and she remembered his voice. One afternoon, standing by the pen, he tried her name the way you test a gate, pushing to see if it held. "Maybelle!" The sound of it crossed the quiet, and she stopped moving. Her head swung, eyes fixing on him. For a moment, the world hung still. He spoke it again, slower, almost like prayer. She blinked and let out a deep exhale, settling into straw. No tricks, no training, just recognition. A meeting at last. That simple echo opened something in him. He made it a practice after that, speaking her name more than silence demanded. At feeding, at dusk, after storms rattled shutters. Each time she shifted toward him without fear. A creature too large for most men's barns had given him acknowledgement without condition. The days stretched into a routine neither had known in years. He mended a piece of fence every morning, rubbed oil into worn hinges, carried buckets that dug sore grooves into his hands. She tested the boundaries, pressing shoulders against planks, nosing at latches. He learned where strength must be doubled, where posts sunk deeper. Slowly, their actions overlapped like two gears finding mesh. When she bristled at a crow overhead, he felt a jolt in his own chest. When his voice settled into calm, her breath leveled. Evenings gathered them both under fading light. He ate quick meals at the table, often tasteless, then stepped outside with nothing urgent to do but stand near her pen. Sometimes she lay in straw, massive body rising and falling to a rhythm impossible to rush. Other times she roamed the edges, snout rooting earth as though searching for lost treasure. Watching her filled hours once spent staring at walls, the veteran sometimes caught himself wondering why he had chosen her, burden that she was. Grain bins emptied faster than he could count dollars. Repairs spread further than his hands could manage. Yet every time words like too big or useless ghosted back from the auction, he found their echo fading against the reality of her watching him, breathing steady, waiting. She was not too much once set apart from judgment. She was exactly enough to be what she was. So the man and Maybelle carved out their quiet corner. Two creatures dragged from lines of laughter and dismissal, now bound by simple survival. The world outside remained sharp, with neighbors and debt and weather still waiting. But in the yard, against the slow cornfield wind, there was a pattern forming. Grain rattling in a trough, boots crunching gravel, one voice calling a name, and one head turning to meet it. The house was always dark when he woke, not because the lamp was out, but because his eyes refused to clear from what they had just witnessed. Dreams dragged him back to places he did not name aloud, towns without roofs, nights split by tracer fire, sudden silence when men stopped shouting. He would jolt upright and sweat, heart pounding, air whipping in like a drill whistle. Some nights he paced, fists rubbing his brow. Other times he leaned heavily against the window frame, searching for shapes in the yard to remind himself of where he truly stood. And always there was Maybelle. Bulk pressed against the cool earth, a slow rhythm of breath rising from her chest. Even when the night turned long and pitiless around him, her presence carved the channel of steadiness. She shifted once in a while, grunting low,
reminding him he was not the only living soul circling this ground. He would whisper her name, cracked and uncertain, until the sound calmed his shaking hands. There had been other nights, in other lands, when noise was all he knew. Shelling, engines, the cough of a rifle in darkness, that constant din carved furrows into his mind. Sleep had never recovered from that. But the sound Maybelle made, thick and deep as if anchored in clay, filled the empty in a way he had not known he needed. One living creature cared nothing for his past or his failings. She breathed because she must, and in doing so, gave him something to measure his fear against. By day, his body carried scars quieter than his nightmares. Knees stiff with fatigue, shoulders jerking when trucks rattled down the road. The smallest crack, a screen door banging, would send him stiff until he steadied on a fence post. There had been men who once leaned on him in foreign fields, comrades who trusted his aim and his word. Some had not come home. That loss curled around him each time he thought of them. Survival bent him heavy, like a man still carrying a pack after the march ended. And into that load walked this enormous pig. Where neighbors saw only pounds of flesh and cost to feed, he began to see ballast. Her body, mocked at the auction, now carried a solidity he envied. Where he trembled inside at the faintest echo, she grounded herself, unhurried and impossible to knock from stance. More than once he rested his palm across her pink hide, feeling both warmth and weight. She took no pride in any of it. She simply existed whole. That simple existence steadied him. He discovered that her routine compelled him to create his own. Without her, he might have slept until dusk or wandered aimless between broken tools. But she demanded food at dawn, water drawn and barrels topped off. If he delayed, she announced it with snorts that rattled walls. That insistence pulled him from bed when memories might have drowned him in sleeplessness. With his hands busy shoveling grain, he noticed his breath returned. His focus narrowed not to weapons, but to feed sacks. On rough afternoons, he lingered with old thoughts, unwelcomed ones of the last patrol or the flight home. Faces rose unbidden, names pressed against his conscience. He would find his feet leading him to Maybelle's side. She greeted him the same whether he came shaken or steady, whether his words were curses or silence. Nose pushing at his sleeve, breath damp upon his arm, she asked for nothing but his being near. In that, he found what therapy had failed to unearth, a reason beyond himself to stand upright. The yard changed tone accordingly. Where once it had sung of neglect, now there was a pulse of life. Not tidy or lush, but genuine. Mud churned where she rooted, boards cracked where she leaned. Yet into each gap he sank new posts, hammered nails, patched roofs. Not to please neighbors or earn profit, but because she required it. And in meeting her need, he stumbled into the beginnings of purpose. He noticed, too, how the ridicule she had borne mirrored his own scars. Men at the auction jeered at her size, dismissed her before testing her heart. He, too, had been cast in categories since returning: unfixable, unstable, unemployable. He saw in her steady watch the same indignity reversed into resilience. She endured their laughter by standing still. He endured his failures by caring for her. Two dismissed creatures circling back into meaning. Some evenings he built small fires out back, not for warmth, but for the echo of patrol camps, where flames marked a fragile circle of safety. Maybelle often settled near, not spooked by sparks, resting massive head against earth with eyes half shut. He would sit there, boots dug into gravel, and let words slip out, though no reply would come.
half-finished stories, fragments of names, confessions spoken low. She gave no judgment, only presence. That was enough. In time, he recognized something strange. Crowds had once mocked her weight as burden, yet that heavy frame became his balance. If a man losing step leans into another, so too did he lean into her sheer existence. Not with reins, not by training, but simply by standing near. He steadied his breath in rhythm with hers. He began to trust the earth again beneath his boots. Thus the echoes of war still reached him, but they no longer swallowed him whole. They were tempered by an animal too big for small judgments, too present to be dismissed. The veteran and the pig carried their scars side by side. Survival had first bound them, but something deeper had begun to grow. The world had always been a tangle of smells and sounds first. Sharp edges of iron where chains rubbed. Bitter sweat from men who came with shouting voices and rough hands. Grain tossed thin, never enough to fill, always gone too soon. The pig remembered these patterns without needing to think. Her body carried them in scars, her steps cautious on every surface. But now the air shifted. Here the earth smelled quieter. Rich soil, damp wood, grass not yet trampled by too many hooves. The man's voice was unlike the others, not high, not sharp. It carried a worn edge, softer but heavy as a stone. When he spoke, it was not command but recognition, as if sound itself bent toward her rather than against. She did not trust quickly, but she listened. Nights were cold, and the fence pressed strange against her hide. She paced at first, not because she wished to escape, but because such motion had always kept danger at bay. Each turn matched the rise and fall of her breath, each grunt a reminder to the darkness that she was still alive. The man often stood nearby, quiet. She smelled unease on him, the quick salt of sweat when he startled. But he did not strike, did not shout. His silence was not neglect, but endurance. The first time he spoke her name, she felt the sound hum deeper than any previous noise. Not a command, not a shove. It carried recognition. She halted in her pacing, ears pricking, head turning despite her stubbornness. The syllables, Maybell, rolled heavy across the air, and though she could not shape meaning, she sensed identity. A sound joined to her flesh, different from laughter in the auction pen, different from jeers. Here was acknowledgement. She tested him across days, waiting by water until he filled the trough, edging near when he mended boards. Her nostrils flared with his scent. Tobacco, iron, leather, and something weary lingering deep. She remembered hands that struck, yet his never rose. They hung low at his sides, palms opened, sometimes toward her, never quick enough to alarm. Trust, for her kind, came slow. Hunger was easier to satisfy than wound. So she watched, measured, paced. At dusk, when night sense deepened, the barn creaked and owls stirred above fields. She settled into straw while his steps scraped near. He would sit not far, sometimes mumbling noises too long for her mind to grasp, but his tone, low, rough, carrying weight of stones, told her enough. He gave his voice as offering, the way one creature lulls another. In answer, she let her body sigh, long and steady. A signal older than words. I remain. I do not flee. The turning point arrived in the simplest form, his palm with feed balanced on it. She had known buckets, had known force, had known bait worth deception. Rarely had she been given choice. That night, lantern light weak against farmyard dark, he held out grain, not driving her closer, but waiting. She hesitated, nostrils burning with smell of earth and sweat mingled. The silence pressed. At last she stepped forward. Her snout brushed his skin, bristly and damp, and she gathered kernels straight from his hand. The man did not flinch, though her weight could have toppled him. He breathed slow, steady, scent of fear thinning, replaced with something calmer. She heard a sound, relief, escape his throat. And in that plain act, fence lines between them bent. He had offered without demand. She had taken without battle. From then onward, the rhythm shifted. She no longer paced the pen as if every corner carried threat. Instead, she moved with slower purpose, often choosing to graze near where he worked. Winds came across the fields, carrying rustle and storm scent, but she knew his voice cut through it, strong enough to guide. Bonds among animals are not forged by promises, but by repetition and steadiness. She found both in his presence. The wilderness seemed to note the change. Birds perched closer. Crows wheeled overhead, without scattering at her bulk. Even the stray dogs at fence edge no longer drew panic. She faced them broadside, anchored. And always his figure nearby, a post as certain as ground itself. The unwanted pig had measured one man and found him worthy. In that judgment, she gave him loyalty the way earth gives back a seed once buried. The bond had been quiet, but true, sealed in a way the auction crowd would never understand. Still, life has its own way of testing every bond. The first signs came not from storms or hunger, but from human talk. One morning, the veteran hauled grain from town, sweat rolling down his back as he lifted sacks in and out of his truck. Two men, leaning on the feed store rail, eyed the purchase and chuckled. "What's he got that big pig for?" one said loud enough. "Ought to butcher it while there's still meat in the world worth keeping." Another added, "Or sell her for scraps before she eats him out of his own walls." Their laughter rang against tin siding. The veteran pretended not to hear, but the words sank like stones. Back at the farm, Maybelle greeted him with a low nudge, eager for her share. He dropped feed into the trough, yet in the movement of her jaw he heard a knell of cost counting down. Americans used to say a dollar doesn't stretch far enough. He measured every coin now by how much grain it bought. Winter loomed, and larders ran thin. At night, he sat under the single bulb in his kitchen, bills stacked like enemy files before him. His wage work came irregular, mending fences for neighbors, clearing brush. Never enough. And there was her feed. He caught himself muttering aloud. Maybe they were right. Maybe she's too much. The sound startled him. He looked across the empty room, ashamed because Maybelle wasn't even there to hear. But the thought now existed, and he couldn't take it back. The setbacks grew heavier. With autumn storms came battering winds. One morning he woke to find her pen half collapsed, boards strewn across mud. Maybelle pacing on the outside as if embarrassed by freedom she never asked for. He cursed, boots sucking wet earth as he gathered wood. His hands bled, nailing each plank back. The storm had tried the fence once, and as far as neighbors were concerned, it would try again until it broke for good. Adding salt to strain, the local veterinarian stopped by on his monthly round. Maybelle had scraped her side raw against a snapped board. Nothing fatal,
But the vet pressed medicine into his hand and named a price that turned the veteran's gut. He paid, though it felt like pouring out tomorrow's meals just to steady one wound. That evening, as he dabbed ointment on her broad hide, she shifted closer, letting her weight lean against him almost like trust. Sweat dried cold on his back as he whispered, "I can't even take care of me, let alone you." Neighbors didn't let it rest. Passing trucks slowed along the gravel road, men leaning against steering wheels, shaking their heads. Comments landed like blows. "That pig's a sinkhole for feed. Better hope winter's kind." He suffered them silent, jaw muscles working. Pride was one thing, but shame gnawed worse. Each setback stirred up ghosts. The fence collapse mirrored patrol positions falling in battle. Men he couldn't hold on to when mortar struck. The scraped hide on Maybelle brought back images of comrades dragged wounded, him pressing rag to wound while shouting for a medic that took too long coming. She survived because she was built for it. But his memory whispered, not everyone had. That night, he sat outside the barn, knees drawn up, and doubts pressed hard. Maybelle shifted in straw close by. She rumbled a noise, steady as earth. He buried his face in palms, muttering, "I can't lose another. Not again." The words came raw, ragged, thick with dread. She couldn't answer, but her breathing set a rhythm against his ears, as if to say, "I'm here, still." But he knew presence didn't erase cost or community scorn. Determination pushed him toward another try. He reinforced the pen. Double posts sunk feet into the ground, boards lashed with crossbeams. He worked until hands blistered, shoulders screaming. When he finally stepped back, mud caked up to his calves. The pen looked rugged enough to withstand a fighter's blow. He spat into dirt and thought maybe he had turned the tide. But storms don't wait for pride. A week later, another thunderhead rolled across fields, wind wrenching shingles from roofs, lightning flashing like gunfire. He rushed outside at dawn, soaked through, finding half his effort shredded. Maybelle snorted, frantic, circling broken planks. He sprinted into the muck to calm her, hand on side, whispering steadying words. It felt like rushing back into fire when cover collapsed. His gut twisted in old fear. He braced her with words instead of armor, but fear whispered, "This will slip away too." Money bled faster now. Each reinforcement meant more nails, more lumber, more days of labor traded away for items devoured by weather. Each sack of grain vanished in whirlwind paces. He trimmed meals, cut portions, lived on coffee and crusts while Maybelle ate what she needed. It was no hero's sacrifice, only survival math. Still, he carried it with resentment and love mixed in one heavy weight. Compounding hardship, Maybelle injured herself worse. She pressed against jagged timber left from the second collapse, tearing hide deeper, blood bright against pale skin. He jolted into action, memories screaming from older wounds. He tied cloth quick, cursing under breath, eyes wet without invitation. He thought of men who bled under his hands years before, men he couldn't save. Guilt slammed anew as he wrapped cloth tight, whispering desperate promises to a pig who didn't understand words but seemed to sense sorrow. Her breathing slowed against him, not frantic now, but steady with trust. The sound shredded him. She trusted his protection, and he might fail. Neighbors came nosy after the storm, glancing at the wound, lips twisting. One said, "Told you she'd break you." Another sighed, "Bestseller while she still walks. Could get your money yet." He shook his head and led Maybelle away. Silence harder than shouting. Behind closed doors, his chest heaved with conflict. He could not give her up, yet he wasn't sure he could carry on. In his kitchen, lamplight shaking, He stared at her name scratched into wood with his knife. Letters rough but present. He traced them with his thumb. Mind split. Memories reminded him what happens when bonds fail under fire. Men dug graves in haste. He could not repeat that. Yet fear told him failure waits in every shadow.
So Act 5 closed with uncertainty. Debt, storms, neighbors, wounds. A man who had seen too much death questioning if he had stumbled into one more loss just waiting. Beneath his words of worry, though, Maybelle still moved steady, still breathed her rhythm. That breath was the only thing tying him upright, even as he feared losing her. He told himself in a whisper, almost too soft to catch. "Hold on, Maybelle. Just hold on." The night cracked open with thunder that rolled deep enough to rattle window glass. Rain hammered the tin roof in sheets, and the wind shoved against the boards as though the whole farmhouse might peel away. The veteran had known storms before, had crouched under skies torn with artillery. But here, when he woke sweating, it was rain, not mortar fire. Still, his body didn't care. His pulse shot fast, and memory dragged close. He pulled on boots without tying laces, heart already beating in warning. The power had failed. The whole house sat dark, but for lightning blooming against the walls. He pushed open the door and stepped into a world running silver with water. Yard turned to swamp in minutes, mud dragging heavy at his steps. The barn's shadow bent sideways under wind. He barely heard Maybelle's cries through the racket, but when he did, it cut him in half. The barn doors had blown partly in, banging loud. Water pooled against foundations, torn into rivulets running into stalls. Maybelle paced inside, hooves splashing, eyes wild, smooth orbs in the lantern light he finally sparked alive. She bellowed, a sound that could flatten the man's chest. For a fractured second, he saw not a pig but a comrade, flailing in smoke, calling for help. His chest froze, his feet held. Then she cried out again, and his whole body jolted awake. He splashed in, boots filling with water, lantern swinging. Boards had blown, gaps streaming in rain. Her pen had a foot of water sloshing already, rising fast. For her size, even half a body's depth could spell disaster. She snorted, shoved at rails, eyes locking on him. Her terror broadcast the way soldiers' eyes once had, wordless, searing, pleading. He felt command return. Act or watch someone drown. He grabbed ropes and poles scattered against wall. Hands shook, but he forced them steady. He shouted loud so his voice cut through the boom of thunder. "Hold steady, Maybelle!" "Hold, girl." A ridiculous order. She was no trained beast. But she stilled for one beat. Just enough. He planted posts, braced broken slats, creating a rough ramp where boards had collapsed. Rain made tools slick, nails slipping, but there was no time to slow. Each strike echoed like gunfire. Then came the rope. He looped it quick across her thick shoulder, heart beating wild. She could easily knock him flat, drown them both in mud. But when he tugged and growled her name, she yielded weight, following. Not pretty steps, not clean, but each one toward the rising gap. He shouted again over the storm. Short bursts like orders barked. "This way. Step up. Maybelle, here." At one point, mud took his leg nearly to knee. He lurched forward, feeling the ground disappear, cold searing through. His balance broke. He slammed against muck, rope burning his palm. For a flash, nightmare fused with real. Comrades falling, screams, drowning in dark. But then, refusal. He wouldn't lose this one. He gripped rope tighter, lungs shoving breath back into himself. Surprise came next. She moved toward him. Instead of jerking away, Maybelle leaned, braced hooves, pulled slack out of line. The bulk of her weight shifted in his direction, dragging him upright. He stumbled, sputtered water off lips, eyes wide. She had nearly saved him by accident, yet not accident. Her eyes fixed him, and her grunt sounded almost like insistence. "Get up. Keep moving." He listened. Rope wound again around his arm. He nudged forward, guiding her across the rising flood to the door. She obeyed each urgent tug, not with perfect precision, but with trust enough to follow. Water reached her stomach by then, logs of debris brushing her sides. And yet she pushed through, muscle driving forward. Lightning flashed, and her pale hide glistened like forged iron. He shouted her name again, voice breaking. "Maybelle, come on!" Finally, they broke free into open yard, soaked under furious rain. The wind blasted, pelting waves across them, but her frame stood tall, steadied by grass underfoot. He doubled over, gasping for air. She circled near him, stomping mud, waiting, ears twitching, but her gaze latched tight on him. For a moment, he thought of what men had said at the store, how neighbors sneered. Too much to feed, too big a burden. And yet here she was, enormous strength holding him to ground at his weakest. In that sodden yard, thunder cracking the sky apart, he realized weight was not burden, it was anchor. That massive frame, dismissed by all, had just kept him from slipping into darkness again. He moved close, pressing a hand against her slick side. Her breath gusted out warm steam in cold rain. He closed his eyes a beat, forehead leaning against hide. "You carried me, Maybelle," he whispered, rough. He didn't know if she heard sense in words, only that she exhaled steady, grounding storm with her rhythm. Together they waded to higher ground, barn loosened behind like a broken hull. When the wind eased at last, he tied quick shelter with tarps between posts, enough to keep rain off her hide until dawn. Each knot stung his blistered hands. She eased down into mud with grunts, exhausted but calm. He dropped beside her, back against her warmth, letting exhaustion consume him not with terror this time, but with gratitude. As morning broke pale over drowned fields, silence finally arrived except for drip of water. He woke, shivering against her bulk. She grunted low, shifting limbs stiff from wetness. Yet she was alive, eyes clear. He sat up, scanning wreckage. Half the barn collapsed, feed bins flooded. More cost, more rebuilding ahead. But for once despair didn't swallow him. She leaned into him once, solid, deliberate. In that weight he found answer. She wasn't burden. She was companion. Neighbors would laugh at wreckage, mutter he should have let storms take her. Bills remained, debt unchanged. But deep in his chest, something had tilted. He had gone in that night, fearing once more he would fail a bond as he'd failed before. Instead, Maybelle had shown different. Storm tried to break them, yet in rain and flashes of fire sky, they carried each other out. He understood now. It wasn't which creature carried whom. It was both. Load traded between. A man and a pig, each outcast, had bound survival into one thread. For the first time since returning from war, the veteran knew he wasn't walking alone. And that truth soaked deeper than any storm could wash away. The storm had passed, leaving wreckage in its wake. Shingles scattered across the yard, posts leaning in twisted angles, grain bins waterlogged beyond use. Yet the morning had also left a strange calm,
a calm anchored by the sight of Maybelle standing steady, slick hide drying under the faint sun. The veteran rose from the mud, aching in every muscle, but her presence beside him turned that ache into something bearable.
The first days after the flood were nothing but work. He tore down broken walls and raised fresh beams with hands blistered raw. The barn, half collapsed, became a skeleton he patched one rib at a time. His body protested. Shoulders throbbed, knees stiffened, back screamed at every lift. Still, he kept at it, because Maybelle stood there waiting, eyes following every swing of the hammer, every coil of rope pulled tight. That simple watching gave him reason not to quit. She walked the line of wreckage, almost like a guard, her hooves pressing mud into firm platforms where he balanced beams. Sometimes she nudged boards closer with her snout, unknowing but helpful in her way. He caught himself muttering thanks to her, as if she were a labor hand rather than livestock. The rhythm shifted. Rebuilding was no longer a man's lonely task, but a shared weight. She didn't carry nails or set rafters, yet her presence steadied each strike he made. When dusk came, he fed her from buckets hauled the hard way over churned ground. She greeted him with low grunts that rose into a soft rhythm, a pattern steady as a clock. He would answer aloud without thinking, words plain and unfiltered. He told her where the next beam might fit, where the mud still needed drainage. She didn't answer with words, but she stayed near, and that was answer enough. Some nights he sank down by her side in straw lined with fresh hay salvaged from neighbors. He had never been one for using nicknames. War taught a man to keep names straight, clean. But with her, he stumbled into softer sounds. "Belle," he tried once, resting a hand on her shoulder. The syllable slipped easier in tired breath. From then on, he found himself layering voice with small variations, like a man testing notes on an old guitar. "Belle. May. Big girl." Each drew a flick of her ear or a nudge of her snout. Their own language, built piece by piece, closer contact grew natural. At first, his hand leaned uncertain along hide as rough as sanded wood. Over time, he ran his palm with intent, tracing ridges, scars, and folds. Each scar became less defect and more record, proof of survival, same as the lines burned into his skin and memory. Where others once saw waste or ugliness, he began to see strength layered into every mark. When he pressed his hand firm and whispered steadiness, she blew warm air against his arm, and something as simple as breathing together stitched his chest tighter. The therapy came hidden inside daily routine. He didn't call it healing. He didn't even notice it at first. But chores stretched smoother. His breathing calmed when he worked alongside her. His shoulders dropped slack without command. Stress that once pinned him sharp began to dull, replaced by steady repetition. Fill trough, repair fence, pat her flank, whisper name. Routine was his medic now. Maybelle the one who enforced it. When he carried buckets through wreckage, he sometimes paused, chest tight, ready for panic. But she would grunt behind, rooting mud, grounding the scene in present tense. In those moments, storms of memory lost some grip. Anchored by her, he could separate past from now. Word drifted beyond his fence line. Neighbors carried tales of him dragging that pig through floodwaters, refusing to let her drown. Some called it foolish. Others shook heads in disbelief. Still, curiosity bloomed. Trucks slowed deliberately, eyes lingering on the rebuilt barn where he worked with her always near.
Attention once hostile, now bent toward awe, even if spoken with disbelief. And though pride wasn't his aim, he noticed how his posture lifted straighter each time her nickname left his lips in their hearing. Through weeks of repairing and routine, something subtle rebuilt within him as surely as the barn rose from ruin. The house no longer felt empty, not with Maybelle settled within earshot. Fields no longer hummed silence, not with her hooves pressing daily paths. His pulse no longer spiked as sharply, not with her breath sinking steady across night hours. A pig mocked at auction had become more than presence. She was access, turning his broken rhythm into something survivable. The bond was not loud, not celebrated, but lived in tasks, repeated until muscles forgot they were injured. Each nail driven sunk deeper than wood. It sank into the space between despair and endurance. And pressed against her hide, feeling warmth radiate into his bones, he knew why he had muttered those nicknames. It wasn't just silliness. It was ownership of a story they now carried together. A story too stubborn for storms or neighbors to erase. The repair of storm wreckage and the slow, steady rhythm of Maybelle's breathing had drawn the veteran back into a kind of life. But no man's land stays private forever. Word spread beyond the fence line. It began small, an old neighbor slowing his truck when the veteran bent in mud with the pig looming beside him. Then a child whispering in town about the giant pink one they saw in the pasture. Curiosity traveled as quick as weather. By late spring, the first visitors arrived uninvited down the gravel lane. A pair of boys on bicycles parked at the ditch and stared open-mouthed through the wire. When the veteran stepped onto the porch, he expected mocking or taunt. Instead, the younger one breathed out, "She's huge." They did not run when Maybelle pushed her snout toward them, snorting clouds through the fence. They laughed, shaky with awe, then pedaled back toward town, shouting descriptions wild enough to stretch truth. More followed. Families came with excuses, bringing spare hay, asking after repairs. They lingered, though, near her pen. Children squealed when she trotted toward them. Their parents whispered disbelief at her size. Some still smirked relief that she belonged to him, not them. But others softened, leaning closer as though distance would cheat the shock of her intimidating bulk. The veteran held himself stiff through these gatherings. Crowds pressed his heart into wrong rhythms. Strange voices on his yard reminded him of deployments into unfriendly markets overseas. Yet behind his discomfort, he saw Maybelle shift calm the moment children laughed. She rooted ground unconcerned, massive body diffused by innocence that reached over fences better than any words he could manage. Not everyone softened. At the co-op, a farmer nudged his friend, loud enough to catch ears. "That hog's a fool's expense." Another laughed about how much meat she could yield if hung and processed. They said it with gleam, like it was generous advice. The veteran carried his sacks without answering, though his jaw locked hard until his teeth ached. Pride coiled under skin. He didn't bring her home to be cut into pounds. He had brought her home because no one else would. That reason hadn't shifted, yet practicality punched too. Feed bags stacked like debt in his truck. Rebuilding supplies drew dollars faster than they came back in. He tallied costs during nights by lamp, tired eyes running columns that never balanced. Neighbors' words returned sharper. Butcher, sell, turn her bulk into profit rather than waste. He hated them for speaking what he too whispered under breath. At moments, fear cornered him. Fear that he had yoked himself to a burden impossible to haul much longer. Then a different note slipped into the chorus. One evening, a neighbor woman walked across the yard with a burlap sack slung over shoulder. Inside lay bruised apples no market would take. She poured them against the trough, saying, "See if she likes these." Maybelle nosed eagerly, crunching fruit like candy. The woman nodded, a smile breaking thin grief lines in her face, and said, "Might as well feed her instead of letting them rot." It was not generous pity. It was recognition that the animal held worth beyond slaughter. Others followed suit. A teen from up the road asked if she could visit on afternoons, slipping carrots through wire. A man with cattle dropped off leftover corn chops and muttered, "Pig's eating what's wasted anyway." Excuse or not, it was help. The veteran found himself saying thanks more often than he had spoken to neighbors in years. Maybelle, by sheer bulk and gentleness, had begun bridging fences no human word ever could. At first, he resisted that truth. His life had shrunk to silence for safety. The pig threatened to undo that careful retreat. Yet watching children reach flat palms toward her hide, laughing when her bristles tickled and not flinching at her mass, scratched deep into him. These were not jeers from auction pens, but wonder. Maybelle carried dignity he no longer saw in himself, and people responded. But the sharpest challenge arrived with an offer on lined paper. A local buyer, known for collecting unusual livestock, drove up, looked Maybelle over, and handed the veteran a figure written clear. It was more money than his last 4 months' work combined. Enough to ease debts choking him. Enough to set his winter stores steady. The buyer said plain, "You've nursed her back. Now let me pay you right. She's worth more on a table than wasting under your care." The veteran stood stone with the figure trembling in his hand. Neighbors had warned. Voices of reason pressed heavy now that relief dangled so close. He looked across the yard at Maybelle, mud still clinging from their rebuild, eyes soft, flank scarred by storms. He thought of nights her breath alone kept him out of nightmares, of the rope that dragged him from water, of nicknames whispered when fear pressed too close. Money carried answers. But she carried something different, something no account column could tally. He folded the offer once, twice, jammed it deep into his pocket, and said low, "She's not for sale." The buyer blinked, tried again with a number higher, but the veteran shook his head. His chest ached with the weight of refusal, but his decision did not bend. This pig was not commodity. She was kin. The buyer drove off, dust trailing behind. The veteran returned to Maybelle's side and pressed his palm against her warming skin. She blew air, unconcerned with what negotiations had just passed. She had never doubted. Only humans mistook value for worth. That evening, when whispers of his refusal rippled through neighbors, some laughed outright. Others shook heads and said it was pride driving him broke. Yet a few gave him respect in their silence, shoulders dipping as if understanding the weight of standing firm against the easy way. By the time stars showed, the choice had set like concrete. He sat on the barn step, listening to crickets rise and Maybelle grunt slow in the dark. He whispered, "They'll never see you right, but I do." The words came not as speech, but as vow carved out of quiet. The challenge remained. Bills unpaid, mouth skeptical, but the community around him had shifted. Not whole acceptance, not yet. Rather, a strange blend of mockery and admiration, hostility and generosity. And at center stood a pig once left for dead, now knitting broken ties by her presence. Every bond a man holds faces its test. This one had entered fire already and carried him through. Outside voices pushed for surrender, but the veteran knew. The true value of what he clung to could not be written on paper or boiled into lard. It could only be held in nights like this, silence full of crickets, one man leaning against worn boards, and the steady, grounding breath of an animal once called unwanted, now the heart of his slow return to life.
Evenings settled softer now. The barn stood mended, fences tight, feed arriving from hands that once only jeered. The veteran learned to ease himself into dusk by leaning against Maybelle's side, her hide warm from the day's setting sun. When he laid his palm across the rise of her ribs, he felt his own heartbeat slowly sync with hers. He had not spoken aloud of the past in years. Memories kept locked made rooms darker. Voices turned inward, poison. Yet beside her calm weight, words crept out. At first only fragments, dates, a single name, a sharp image carried from patrol. She never flinched. When silence broke, she stayed steady, chewing hay or breathing against dirt. It encouraged longer sentences, then full stories. He told her of the desert winds, of men stacked in carriers, of laughter breaking just before the world shelled apart. To tell such things to a person invited judgment, questions, pity. To tell them to Maybelle meant nothing returned, save patience. Yet that was what he craved, space to let words fall without recoil. In the rhythm of her breath, he sensed a kind of listening older than language. That rhythm softened his voice until confession became less wound and more simple fact. Children from nearby spread tales quickly. They said the veteran talked to his pig like to a friend. Some nights, bike chains clattered near his ditch as they tried to spy through boards. They swore they heard his voice half chanting, half whispering. They described the pig lying still under stars, ears twitching as though catching every word. Soon the story entered adult mouths too. At the feed store, someone mentioned it with mocking grin. But within that tone lived something else. Curiosity. When a tale repeats often enough, mockery turns into folklore. And so people began speaking in third-person lines. They say if you walk past his barn at night, you'll hear him talking to her. They didn't need names. Both man and animal had become figures now in a shared story. The veteran himself knew nothing of legend. He only knew the peace it gave him to speak aloud what tore inside. He sometimes leaned on her flank so fully that his knees bent into straw. There he admitted fears that still tightened his chest. What if another storm stole her? What if neighbors forced him through debt to sell? He named every guilt he carried from his platoon's worst day. Maybelle breathed louder, heavier, and he imagined each exhale carrying his weight out into night. He discovered that what mocked her once, the sighs, the slowness, was what made her best at listening. Smaller creatures twitch at movement, vanish when storms break. Maybelle remained. Huge enough to absorb feeling, still enough to sustain trust. Where his soul staggered restless, her quiet mass absorbed it until he steadied beside her. There came evenings under summer skies when he caught himself humming low, tuneless songs, words forgotten but rhythm intact. Maybelle kept chewing, not bothered by sound. He realized he hadn't sung since returning from service. To give voice in that way meant safety enough to risk joy. He did it now because, leaning against her bulk, he felt unseen eyes soften instead of sharpen. By late season, he no longer cared whether neighbors assumed foolishness. He understood that they would never see what he saw. A partner whose loyalty was breath and patience, not commands. His posture began to change around them. Shoulders pulled less tight. Eyes ranged softer over faces, not seeking danger, but entry. Maybelle, without knowing, had walked him back into a kind of belonging. On one still night, he sat cross-legged in dirt as the moon grew long shadows from her shape. He traced with his hand the scars on her flank, stories of mistreatment before he came. Then he spoke clear.
They thought you useless. Look now. They thought me ruined. Here we stand." The words carried both truth and defiance. If folk magic lingers anywhere, it lingers in such confessions. The speech between outcasts that binds them stronger than community sanction. And indeed, people passing on country lanes began using her as reference point. Like that pig out at the veterans' place, too big till proved steady. She was measure of survival, and through her, so was he. But beyond talk, real acceptance came inward. The veteran finally looked through his window at night and did not fear shadows. He put tools back in order without dread of never using them. He cooked larger meals, sometimes slicing fruit extra just to bring to her trough. He realized one morning that his hand reached to pat her shoulder not out of fear she would vanish, but from simple habit of affection. That was acceptance enough. The cadence of life grew slower, older, almost mythic. People in town spun it as story, but for him, it was routine with bones of ritual. As dusk fell, he stepped out with a lantern. Maybelle awaited, eyes glinting. He would speak, she would breathe, and silence between them carried meaning deeper than words. No one outside needed to grasp it. The folktale tone belonged to them alone. Outcast soldier and unwanted pig, reshaping each other's place in the dark. Witness saw only a man muttering to livestock, but if you stayed longer, past midnight, you'd hear truth. One broken heart carried by two steady breaths, keeping night watch together beneath stars. The invitation came folded small in the veteran's mailbox. Handwritten, plain. A note from town organizers asking him to bring Maybelle to the county fair. At first he laughed sharp, thinking it a prank. But the names signed at the bottom were real, penned by men and women who once sneered at the size of his hog. Now they wanted her on display, like curiosity or wonder. He turned the paper again and again under lamplight. Fairs met crowds, noise, engines backfiring, children crying, triggers that rattled his chest in wrong rhythms. Just the thought of it pressed sweat into his palms. He muttered aloud, "No good will come from that." Yet as he looked out the window, Maybelle stood calm, breath rolling from her sides. She had steadied him through storms and shame. Could he not endure a fair for her sake? Days later, he loaded her into the same trailer that had carried her from auction yard months earlier. This time, though, she walked the ramp with confidence, hooves firm, eyes scanning horizon not with fear but recognition. He murmured nicknames to steady himself more than her. "Easy now, Belle. Big girl, keep close." As he latched the gate, neighbors passing slowed trucks to watch. Some grinned, some shook heads. But no one laughed outright. The fairgrounds bustled as they arrived. Steam rose from food stands, music burst from speakers, livestock lined in pens with ribbons flashing. He braced for mocking, braced for someone to call her worthless again. Instead, silence fell short when she came down the ramp. Heads turned. Children gasped, pulling parents closer. A group of farmers craned necks, whispering disbelief. Word spread quick. The giant pink hog that survived the flood, that man's strange companion, was here. The veteran led her slow, rope slack, letting her pace comfortable. His pulse pounded, but tightness eased when she grunted steady, brushing against his hip. For once he didn't walk alone into a crowd. She parted the noise with her sheer presence. People stepped back, but not mockingly, respectful of her mass, wide-eyed at gentleness. At the livestock judging ring, no ribbon fit her category. She was neither lean show sow nor commercial prize. Judges looked at each other awkwardly, but the crowd had already chosen their champion. Children cheered as she rooted calmly, taking carrots from strangers' hands with soft precision. Mothers laughed in relief that such size could carry no menace. Fathers muttered about feed costs, but admitted admiration. By midday, even the fair announcer called her name over loudspeaker, voice lifting. Maybelle, the gentle giant. The veteran watched all this, heart caught between pride and disbelief. Months before, she had been dismissed outright. He too had been discarded, rendered useless in silence. Now both stood in the ring, alive with attention. For the first time in years, warmth rose in his chest, not from whiskey or anger, but quiet belonging. She had given him that gift, and now the world seemed to acknowledge it. Around him, past comrades' voices whispered from memory. Men who never came home. Men who deserved parades, but received only headstones. He clenched rope tighter and swallowed hard. Perhaps this was not parade, but it was recognition of survival, of endurance. Maybelle carried weight, both hers and his, into light. When the sun dipped low, painting fairgrounds gold, he sat on a bale of straw within her pen. Crowds thinned, lights strung across poles humming alive. Maybelle settled near, flank pressed against his shoulder. He rubbed her scarred hide. Each grew familiar under his palm. He knew debts still waited at home. Barns still required labor. Nightmares still lurked in dark. But in that moment, sitting against her steady frame, none of it mattered. They had crossed from unwanted to accepted. The final image belonged not to applause or ribbons, but to a quiet, weighty lean. He rested his hand flat against her back, fingers spreading across warmth. She sighed deep, entire body easing into his side. The sound rolled low like a hymn. He whispered, only for her ears, voice soft as dusk, Maybelle. Around them, fairlights flickered, children's laughter carried, and dust settled slow upon the earth. Yet within that circle, the veteran and his pig existed alone. Two survivors, bound by name, by scars, by the stubborn refusal to be discarded. He breathed deep, exhaling calm that months earlier seemed impossible. From broken soldier and unwanted hog had risen a bond strong enough to face storms, scoffs, and silence. Resolution lay not in money earned, nor debts erased. Resolution hung here, in one man finally finding purpose and care, and one animal finally given dignity. The journey from auction pen to fairground ring revealed what crowd hadn't seen. Burden turned companion. Mockery turned reverence. As evening lowered, he rose, led her back toward trailer, and though muscles still ached, his steps carried lighter. Maybelle followed with trust, bulk swaying calm. Together they walked not toward isolation, but toward life, shaped by mutual belonging. The sun had slipped down behind the ridge by the time they reached home from the fair. Lantern light hung soft in the barn as Maybelle eased into her bedding, flanks rising and falling with slow certainty. The veteran leaned against a post, watching her breath stir straw. He spoke her name once more, quieter than a whisper, as though saying it sealed the story they had made together. She answered only with a long, calm sigh. But that sound was enough. He thought back to the first day, the auction pen echoing with laughter, the gavel falling cold. No one had wanted her. No one had wanted him either. Yet here they both were, scars worn plain, dignity renewed. Two cast-offs, rising into meaning. The lesson stood sharp. What many discard may hold the greatest power to heal. Strength isn't measured by numbers on paper. It's found in persistence, in companionship, in steady breathing shared under difficult skies.
The barn filled with quiet. Outside, crickets called and wind rustled fields, but inside, it was only one man and one pig, survivors together. His palm pressed gently to her side, his posture soft for the first time in years. In that silence, the world finally seemed balanced. This story doesn't end in triumph banners or cured wounds. It ends here, in a barn, at dusk, with a name spoken low and answered in breath. That's all healing ever is. Two beings refusing to give up on each other when everything else says let go. If this carried weight for you, and if you want more tales of resilience and odd kinship between people and animals, subscribe now. The next one may surprise you and stay with you longer than you expect.